Okay, we've begun the recording. Mute button's good. Yeah, Jade, take it away.
Welcome. Today, we're going to give a brief run through of our NIC ISO 2040 decarbonization plan. I'm joined by my teammates, Henry Dreyer, Jeff Fromuth, Max Hermanson, and Jack Mitchell. This report was prepared for Markets for Electric Power at the Duke Nicholas School of the Environment. We're going to start with a brief introduction, then go over our analysis, results, discussion, and the conclusions. Starting with the introduction. NIC ISO is an independent system operator, a hypothetical independent system operator located in the United States, governed by FERC. It's characterized by a 3-bus system, and currently its electricity needs are supplied by fossil fuel and nuclear power plants. We are using the high growth scenario given by an analyst, and there are 7.4 million customers. Currently, there's a total nameplate capacity of over 42 gigawatts, and 100,000 gigawatts are generated each year. We've got a ton of CO2 emitted, and the business as usual is infeasible for 2030 and 2040 based on our model. New generation would need to be added. Moving forward to the analysis. We'll talk about model objectives, model assumptions, model structure, how it works, unit commitment, economic dispatch, the recommended scenario, and technology input details and assumption. I'll pass it to Jack for model objectives.
Thank you, Jade. So our model objective is to determine the average generation dispatch, the average flow on transmission lines, the average locational marginal prices, and the average CO2 emissions for each of the 4 seasons during 2023, 2030, and 2040. And we'll be looking at the peak and average generation during both on-peak and off-peak periods. And this will be given, we'll run the model given the high electricity demand growth that Jade mentioned, our desired emissions reductions of 95% from the baseline of 2023, and as well as the build out of new generation and transmission infrastructure that we have decided on. So some of the model assumptions were given. We were told that there are 3 transmission lines with 900 megawatts of maximum capacity. We're assuming equal impedance and negligible reactance on each of the lines. As mentioned, we're projecting high electric demand growth of 2.5% year over year, every single year. And then the capacity planning for 2030 and 2040, we are building our system to meet peak demand in 2040 under the high growth scenario. Some of the limitations of the model are that the model is run for an instantaneous point in time in each of the seasons throughout 2023, 2030, and 2040. So the ramping capabilities of the various generators are ignored. Another limitation is that some of our non-generations resources, such as energy efficiency improvements or demand response, we are treating those as generators in the model. So in some cases, they may cause unnecessary congestion on the transmission lines, but we're trying to overbuild our transmission capabilities to address, so that we're addressing that issue at least to some extent. And there are other limitations here we can read about. I'll keep on moving forward. So essentially, we are using Excel to summarize all of our data. We're going to import all of that into Python, where we define the indexes, declare parameters, formulate the model, and then solve the model and get our results. So the output for each season throughout each of the 3 years that we're looking at is a dispatch level from each generator, the flow on each transmission line, the LMPs, and the total carbon emissions from each generator. So essentially, the objective function for our model is to minimize costs of generating electricity. The 2 decision variables are power generation and power flow. And then we are constrained by maximum power constraints, node power balance, maximum transmission flow. And then in 2030 and 2040, we're going to introduce maximum CO2 emissions constraint. This is the generation mix by year based on the output of our model. As you can see, coal and natural gas both decline over time, with coal being fully retired by the year 2040. Nuclear and small modular nuclear will both be increasing over time, as well as increases from our renewable resources. And Jeff, do you want to jump in with the retirements here?
Yep. So to maintain system performance reliability, we wanted to make sure that we were balancing all megawatts retired with megawatts coming back online. If you take a look at the graph on the left, you'll see that megawatts retired increases over the first 23 to 30 period, and then again increases from the 33 through 39 period. On the right, you'll see the specific generator listed in the y-axis and its length of operation until it is retired. So for our build out of utility scale solar PV, PV hourly production data from the NIC ISO forecast that our researchers gave us, and the actual production data we performed an analysis of and found that our capacity factor was varying from roughly 14% to 19%, with greatest production in the spring period of March 21st to June 20th. That's about 2,100 hours. Based on the forecast generation, we decided to install 4,834 megawatts of utility capacity by 20. We had already had that amount, and we scaled it up further. So for our utility scale PV model, assuming at each bus we had about 1,600 megawatts. For our future development of solar, we were limited in geographic space just to construct at bus 1. So land costs and were too restricted for building on buses 2 and 3. So capacity factors, as described, we just presented. We used this capacity factor by our model, as you can see on the right. That continues from 23 through 40. System capacity factor peaks at about 55% 2 p.m. And for hours 21 through 7 a.m., we receive and we assume no generation. For utility scale solar, we are operating on the assumption about 10 acres per megawatt in 23. Based on what we've learned and developing, we assume that we can improve to about 5 acres per megawatt by 2040 on average. Based on our ATB assessment of costs, we're looking at a capital cost overnight of $1,288 per kilowatt and a construction financing cost of about $28 per kilowatt. Taken together, we have a CapEx value of about $59.30 per megawatt hour. Values that we chose for construction are in the moderate cost estimation area. Also, O&M is moderate. Annual capital recovery about 6.5%. And starting with the 2021 LCOE, we have about $75.25 per megawatt hour. Finally, for rooftop solar, about 5.9 gigawatts of capacity by 2040. We assume 1.48 million NIC ISO customers choose to install rooftop solar by that period. Based on our analysis of available residential consumers, it's about 40% of total system load. We have a total of 7.4 million customers. Assumptions for rooftop solar, about 15% average capacity factor. 50% of customers actually adopt rooftop solar, and average system size about 4 kilowatts for each roof. Okay, and then moving on to utility scale solar or storage rather. So we are just using batteries for peak hours, not for off-peak. By 2023, we have no installed capacity. By 2030, we've built the first 2,613 megawatts. By 2040, we've completed our system at 5,228 megawatts. We assume 100% complete discharge and efficiency round trip loss about 5%. This is a binary variable in our model, so it's either 1 or 0. Construction costs. Bus 1 is location for most of our utility scale solar, and we have built out batteries by about 22% of total PV capacity for that bus. Average sizing BES available for PV is about 27% of total PV installed, and batteries were built at an even rate across all years from 23 to 30, just to annualize costs and bring them down as we assume that battery costs continue to fall given our ATB assumptions year by year. You can see our assumption of solar plus storage and standalone battery on the right. Up over to Max for nuclear.
Yeah, so nuclear was a pretty major component of the base model, but we eventually veered away from it over time. We didn't expand it too significantly. We only ended up adding about 3 gigawatts. Yeah, and then for wind energy, we installed the maximum amount of 3 gigawatts as well. And the graph on the right kind of just shows the variability of this resource and how it is not dependable every year. And we just did some pretty basic installations of the wind. We didn't install it for specific years. We just installed it for 2030 and then 2040. It and then the CCS and nuclear. Henry, why don't you jump on for this part, please? Also, we're at 12 minutes.
Thank you, Max. Appreciate it. Yeah, so for CCS and nuclear, here are some estimates for the new nuclear and CCS installations. And we're looking for, you can see the CapEx CCS for generator P is 1.21 billion, generator S, a little over $500 million. And you can look at some of the assumptions made to form those calculations. Moving on to the next slide. We have the transmission upgrades. So for the first half of the model from 2023 to 2030, we prioritize grid enhancing technologies. But overall, the main takeaway here is that we anticipate capacity increases from 900 megawatts in 2023 to 3,600 in 2040. And this will certainly help allow for the increased variable resource penetration we anticipate over the time horizon. Next slide, please. And then we have our demand response program. High level here, we anticipate 90% participation rate from commercial and industrial customers. This was based on some information from PJM. And then we also anticipate a residential customer participation rate of 50%. And so we can see here the demand by each customer segment, and then their load participation. And then we assume a 20% demand reduction at peak times. This is based on RMI research. And so you can see the total peak electricity demand reduction of about 8 gigawatts throughout the system by 2040. Next slide, please. And then we have energy efficiency enhancements, which amount to about 15% reduction in demand by 2040. And you can see some of those figures on the right-hand side. Moving on to the next slide, please. And we also incorporate SMRs in our generation portfolio. And we anticipate constructing some of these to become operational by 2030 and the remaining by 2040. And one thing to note is the associated marginal cost is $40 a megawatt hour in our model. And you can see here some of the sources for that figure in the graph on the right. And then we will move along to the next section, which is results. And I will kick it on over to the next member of the team. Jade, maybe you want to take this? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Henry. So yeah, our model results here, we have the output of the model for 2023, 2030, and 2040. The biggest takeaways are that emission intensity and total CO2 generated is going down, as well as total costs are all falling. Locational marginal prices for the average decrease across the 3 reference years. However, the average peak LMPs are increasing across the 3 reference years. This indicates that as zero marginal cost variable resources are added to the grid, there's a decrease in average price, but increased peak pricing volatility. System costs are also decreasing over time. So payments to generators, total variable cost, and generator profits are all going down between 2023 and 2040. The demand response program during peak years, our peak hours is expected to generate about $5 billion in payments to customers who opt in to demand response, compensating those customers for 31 gigawatts over the peak hours during a year. Emissions, as mentioned, decline rapidly between 2023 and 2030, and then continue to decline to that 95% target by 2040. Max will talk about the reliability and sensitivity analysis.
Thanks, Jade. So our sensitivity analysis is really important because this system is subject to extreme weather events during the winter at a probability of 10% chance of this occurring once every year. And when this happens, there's a massive productivity decrease of certain generator types. And so to test this, the effect of this on our system, we looked at the sensitivity of the results of our UC and economic dispatch models. And we used Crystal Ball to analyze different variables, such as costs, revenue, and generation. And the results of this are really interesting. They show that our system will be unable to meet winter storm loads in each of the years. And the amount by which we can't meet this ranges from 1,500 to 3,300 megawatts, which is a lot. And because of this, there's lots of lost potential revenue. And this increases over time, especially as our system becomes more reliant on wind and solar, which are the most impacted by these storm events. You can see some of the major findings here summarized, and it's important to note that the grid should be trying to adapt to this over time. This might be through different types of generation, being more inclusive in our grid, looking at microgrids, and then just decentralizing production in general. And for the discussion section.
So as mentioned, we are adding SMRs to the energy mix in order to meet that peak energy demand in 2040. However, due to ramping constraints, potential ramping constraints associated with them, we decided to leave them on at all times, but that created scenarios where their marginal costs were higher than the LMPs of the system. And for that reason, we will have to rely on capacity markets to fill that gap and make up those associated costs. Another lever we're going to encourage in our system is tax credits or incentives, specifically the renewable electricity production tax credit and the investment tax credit, which currently exists. But if we can continue those in the coming decades, that would help to encourage utility scale PV growth. In terms of transmission construction, FERC recently came out with a new rule that will help to encourage the deployment of grid enhancement technologies, which we are going to make use of, and to expand transmission capacity in our system, which will help with some of the disparities between each of the loads. For example, we can construct solar PV at bus 1, but not any of the other buses. So expanding our transmission capacity will help deal with some of those issues. And then Henry, did you want to jump in here for the job creation?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jack. And so the main takeaway here is that there are over 1.5 million job years created in our model scenario between 2023 and 2040. This is a very conservative estimate. A lot of the anytime you see a job listed, it's assuming it's a one-year job. So we anticipate this being much higher, and you can see it by generation type, what some of the job creation amounts to. And please move on to the next slide. And here are a few more, including job creation coming out of transmission infrastructure, along with nuclear and SMR development. And then I will kick it on over to Jade for our conclusion here. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. So yeah, in conclusion, our plan retires all coal plants, equips some natural gas plants with CCS, has a substantial growth of nuclear, builds out utility solar, residential solar, a moderate build out of wind due to land constraints. You can see our generation mix in 2040 here. This plan will absolutely meet NIC ISO's 95% reduction and does not increase the ability of the system to respond to reliability substantially. So thanks for listening, and please direct any questions. Here's the team, and direct any questions to us here. Yeah, thanks a lot.